Catholic Feminist. Welcome to the second Generation Vatican 2 podcast. I swear I've done this before. So today we're graced by Claire Swinarski. Claire Swinarski is the author of multiple books for children and adults, including Girl Arise, a Catholic feminist's invitation to live boldly, love your faith, and change the world. She's also the founder of The Catholic Feminist, a top-ranked spirituality podcast with almost 2 million downloads. Her writing has been featured in The Washington Post, 17, Milwaukee Magazine, and many other publications. A born and raised Wisconsinite,
yes,
out of Milwaukee with her husband and 2 kids. You can follow her on Instagram at Claire Swinarski, and that's Swinarski. Claire, welcome to the second Generation Vatican 2 podcast. Need to stop drinking so much coffee right beforehand.
I feel ya. I have some coffee with me. So thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Cool. So yeah, Wisconsin. I've got family roots in Wisconsin. I'm a Packer backer all the way. My wife is too, which is nice. So cool. Go Pack. All right. So, hey, start off, you've written many books and some nonfiction, some fiction, and you've also written for various magazines and news articles. You studied journalism and political science. Why were you interested in those?
That's a good question. Honestly, I my whole life have actually wanted to write fiction. That was my goal from when I was like 4. But in high school, everyone really helpfully informed me that that was never going to happen. And so I better think of a career I could do that was writing, that wasn't like fiction writing, something that could actually make money, which is hilarious because journalists are not usually, Oprah level income. But so that's kind of why I went to journalism. I was like, well, I like to write. That's a job. And then while I was studying journalism, I ended up getting a couple different internships with a newspaper and then a governor's office. And I kind of really fell in love with politics. I've fallen out of love with it a lot, but I still am very interested in talking about in culture and policy and those kinds of things. And so I threw on a poli-sci double major. I thought I'll go be a White House correspondent. That was my big goal. Then I interned in DC and was like, I hate everything about this. I am never coming back to this city. I need to live in Wisconsin. And I was also really being awoken to my faith at that point and falling in love with the Lord. And so after college, I became a missionary. So radically different from being a White House correspondent. But I still love to write, and I still am a writer at heart. So that's kind of been the constant thread through everything. But I'm not really doing like a ton of journalism in the typical traditional sense.
I actually didn't know that you spent time as in missions. I only know you through the Catholic Feminist and through your writings. How long were you a missionary?
Yeah, I was a Focus missionary, if people are familiar with Focus. Yes, they go on college campuses and help teach students how to evangelize. So I was a missionary for 2 years. I was at Tulane in New Orleans, and that was wild because at that time, they did not have a Catholic center. They really didn't have any structure. It's very different now. If people are listening to this, they're probably like, the Tulane Catholic Center is phenomenal. This was in 2013. It was a whole different world. And then I went to Mizzou, which was like amazing Catholic center, entire staff, like very organized Bible studies. Like I tell people they could have sent 4 monkeys to Mizzou and it would have been great. Like Mizzou was very, very established, huge, amazing Catholic center. So yeah, I did mission for 2 years and then came back to Wisconsin because my husband was in college at Marquette.
Okay. So you start off wanting to go be a White House correspondent, didn't like the Beltway all that much. Go join Focus Ministries, working at colleges. My experience with Focus is that it's generally, mid-20s people that are maybe slightly removed from college that are doing the majority of the Focus work. Is that true?
It's a range. I think a lot of the people on campus are fresh out of college, so like early 20s. A lot of people doing the more administrative type things are definitely in that mid to late 20s. I mean, there's some on-campus missionaries who are in that age group, but I think you kind of hit a certain age where you're like, I can only hang with the 20-year-olds so much. Like, especially if you're like married and have kids, it's like, oh, I cannot go to this Catholic Center event at 9:00 p.m. I need to go to bed. So that kind of weeds some people out. But yeah, I think a lot of the campus missionaries are in their first couple years right out of school.
Okay. So then you move from that and you get back into authorship again. So you've written nonfiction. I think you just released your second nonfiction, yes?
In October, so almost.
It comes out. Okay, it comes out in October. That's actually when. So we're recording this in August, and this interview will publish mid-October. So probably right around then. Okay.
Awesome.
What's the name of it so people can check it out?
In Full Bloom, finding the grace and grit to thrive where you're planted. Yeah.
Thank you. You've also written a couple pieces of fiction as well. Could you speak a little bit about those?
Yeah, so like I said, I always wanted to write fiction, and I finally published my first fiction children's book in May of this year with HarperCollins. And so that was quite the adventure, many, many years of rejection and editing, but it was really important to me to write middle grade novels because those are my favorite type of book even now. My mom was a fifth grade teacher, so I grew up reading a lot of middle grade children's novels, and I really wanted to write a fiction book that had morals and that involved Catholics, but wasn't like a Catholic book. That was definitely a bucket list of mine. So yeah, that's called What Happens Next, and it's for kids like ages 8 to 13.
Now I saw, at least for What Happens Next, you actually have a Common Core standards-based questions for the book. Is this not just, a youth novel?
Well, it's often able to be used in classrooms. So that's why we have like the Common Core questions, so that if teachers are interested in using it in their rooms, they can do that. So it's broken down into different grade level questions so that it's kind of easy access for teaching it.
Gotcha. By the by, since you did do political science, what are your thoughts on Common Core? I know it's kind of like a hot topic issue.
It is a hot topic issue. I have a lot of big feelings about it. It's tricky for me to talk about because I'm always really sensitive to the fact that teachers don't get a lot of freedom, and they get these standards that they have to teach. I mean, they have to teach to these standardized tests. So I'm not faulting teachers at all for Common Core, but Common Core does kind of bug me. I mean, it's standards that they kind of try to squeeze in one size fits all education, in my opinion. And I'm not the biggest fan of Common Core, to be honest, but I also understand that it's tricky and that we need to be able to evaluate how effective our education is. We need to measure it in some form, and I certainly don't have the best answer to that question either. And so it's always a struggle for me to like criticize it without sounding like I'm being like, well, here I come as an education expert to tell you what you're doing wrong, because that's certainly not true.
So being an author, we'll go back to the book topic quick. Could you talk about benefits of reading? I've heard various things that, hey, reading fiction is supposed to increase your empathy in young children specifically. And then just being a well-read person can, if that's in your formative life, it can lead toward better career, better upward trajectory, things like that.
Yeah, I totally think that's true. And I mean, I've read studies that have said as much, that reading for kids really does build their empathy. Also, reading about a lot of different experiences is good for kids. Reading a book, they can learn about people who grew up in a completely different culture, a completely different time period. It makes learning so much more fun for kids. You can go sit in a classroom and learn about like World War II and the facts, or you can go read a book about a kid in World War II, and that can just be so much more of a creative learning process for them. And I mean, even as an adult, I'm a huge reader. I have like a library book literally right next to me. I'm a regular at my library, and I just think that the art of communication is something that a lot of us are lacking in these modern days. Like, we're all about Twitter, we're all about Instagram stories, and a lot of us have really lost that like written communicative skill. But the best way to be a better writer is to read a lot, and every single one of us needs to know how to write. I do a lot of school visits as an author, and I tell the kids that like, you might not like writing, but like, I have some bad news. If you want to be a police officer, you need to know how to write. If you want to be a doctor, you need to know how to write. It's really a timeless skill, and the best way to get it is by reading a lot. So I'm super passionate about reading, and my kids are obsessed with books. My husband's obsessed with books. We're very much a book family.
I don't know if you've ever read, is it Blank? or maybe The Tipping Point, one of Malcolm Gladwell's books where he says like
I've never read a Malcolm Gladwell book. I feel like a freak. I know everyone loves him. I've got to get onto it.
So I've heard his most recent one isn't up to the same standards as his previous work, but yeah, I think they're great stuff. One of them specifically, he says there's a strong correlation between families that have a large library in their house and the success of the child as they become an adult. Not because just having books has any effect, but because people who have a lot of books generally put a strong emphasis on reading, and that is just another way to help educate your child when they're outside of school.
Right. Yeah, I really love the podcast. Read Aloud Revival is one of my favorites, and it's about children's literature. And she talks in there about, they've done studies where like babies who are read aloud to at age 3 to 6 months have like a way wider vocabulary, even in like first grade. It's really important to do really early on. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned you're a frequent visitor of your library. What are you currently reading?
That's a good question. I just went to the library today, so I'm like, what did I get again? I always try to do like a fiction and then a nonfiction and then a spiritual because I'm a fiction girl at heart. So if I don't make myself read nonfiction, it doesn't get read. So for my spiritual book, I've been working through St. Faustina's Diary for like a year. It's very intense. I have to go very slow. So I'm still working on that. For my nonfiction, okay, my husband is like making me read this book. It's called The Real Lincoln, and it's a book about how Abraham Lincoln, like, isn't the big hero we hold him up to be, because I love Abraham Lincoln and my husband, like, thinks he was a dictator. So he's like, you need to read this book and learn about Abraham Lincoln. So I'm reading that. And then for fiction, I'm between books right now, but I just got a couple from the library today. One of them that I grabbed is called The First Frost by Sarah Addison Allen, and I'm really excited to dig into that. And what fiction have I read lately? Why can I not think of this right now? Oh, I know. I just read a book called Delicious by Ruth Reichel, and it's like a really cute, uplifting, lighthearted story about like a food writer. So I read a lot of diverse things. I'm kind of all over the place.
So along those lines, you had an interview with Marcy Stockman of
Yes.
The Well-Read Mom. And in there, you talked a bit about people who say, oh, I'm just not a reader. What would you have to say to people who just, that's not for me?
I think perhaps you haven't found the right book. I mean, you don't have to love reading as much as I do. I know I'm an outlier here. Like, not everyone has to be reading 3 books at once. But I think reading is so beneficial that if you think you're not a reader, I would really make sure that they're just taking the time to look into what they love. I mean, if there's a topic that you're passionate about, I mean, there's books on sports, there's books on Jesus, there's books on anything that a person could find interesting. And also just expand your idea of what reading is. I mean, graphic novels are really coming back. For the first time this year, a graphic novel won the Newbery Award for kids, which is really cool. Or audiobooks. We love audiobooks in our house. I totally think that counts as reading. My husband, back before COVID, had a really long commute, so he would listen to an audiobook every day. And my kids are always listening to audiobooks while they eat lunch and stuff. So I think just expand your idea of what reading is, maybe. Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to switch gears quick to some of your professional work writing for newspapers and magazines. So we said during your interview, or during your bio, that you've written for the Washington Post. I've also seen that you actually have some articles in Vox, and you don't normally hear the Catholic Feminist writing for those publications. That doesn't seem like they really mesh too well.
No, yeah. I think that people, though, would be surprised at how badly publications actually are very interested in publishing heterodox thought that's outside the norm. Because, my Vox piece is probably my most well-read thing I've ever written. It had kind of a viral moment. It's a piece on pro-life feminism, and they republish it a lot around like Roe versus Wade times. And, like Vox is like, no one would say that Vox is not a liberal publication. Like, I'm just being frank. If you disagree with that, I would be happy to talk more with you. But like, if you look at what Vox has and the popularity of posts, like, people are interested in clicking on things that they think are going to anger them. That sounds weird, but in our click-driven media model at the moment, these websites need people to click. And so if they think that they can put out something that a lot of people are going to click on, that they can show their advertisers, they have really popular content, and if it's well written and well researched, I mean, they're interested in publishing it. I also really like Vox because they don't have a comments section, if I can be blunt. Like, I did get a bunch of emails because my email is like extremely easy to find. But I have been pleasantly surprised by how willing places are to publish thoughts that are outside the norm. I just think people have to be willing to go there and try.
Okay. Well, thank you. Did any of your previous writing filter in or help influence your creation of The Catholic Feminist?
Absolutely. I mean, that Vox piece definitely filtered in. And I've been a Catholic feminist as long as I've been a Catholic. So feminism has always been a really big part of my faith. And a lot of my writing before the podcast was kind of all over the place because I was a freelance writer. So all my freelance writers know, like, you write what you get the check for, man. If they want me to write about diapers, I'll write about diapers. Like, I don't care. I've written about all kinds of topics, but I certainly did have a few pieces like the Vox one that have kind of filtered into the Catholic Feminist. And I think that was helpful when I made the podcast because I had a bit of a following for those issues. And when I was in Focus, I had a blog a million years ago that wasn't like a super popular blog by any means, but it did have a following. And so I had people following me on the internet before I launched the podcast. And I think that's part of why it became successful.
Gotcha. So you said you've been a Catholic feminist for a long time. How did you how do I want to ask this? How were you authentically faithful in that movement without seeming overly zealous?
Well, for a long time, I wasn't authentically faithful. So
okay.
that would
okay.
be a part that comes
Thank
to
you
me.
for that.
I was a feminist from like birth. I literally can't remember not being a feminist. My mom was the one who was taking us to see where the Women's Rights Convention was held, and let's take a road trip to Susan B. Anthony's house. And that's really the environment I grew up in, was one of girl power. Girls can do anything. Girls are smart. Don't be ashamed of being a girl. If you want to love pink, that's awesome. If you want to be a doctor, that's awesome. If you want to be a doctor that loves pink, that's awesome. And I'm really grateful to my parents for that. But my faith life was really not a personal relationship with the Lord until college. And I'm not really sure why that is. I think part of it was that I didn't have great catechesis. Part of it is that my family wasn't really on fire for the faith. And part of it was that I grew up in a very, very liberal city. I grew up in Madison. So, I mean, if you're from Wisconsin, you know, it's very, very vegan, very hip, not a lot of Jesus going on in Madison. And then in college, I really encountered the Lord in a deep way, and I became on fire for my faith, but I never lost that feminist side of me. And the more that I read from the church and the more I learned about the church, and I learned about, you know, the female doctors of the church, and I read John Paul II's writings, I realized how aligned Catholicism and the good of women really are. Like, the Catholic Church desires women's good more than any other institution, way more than a lot of the popular feminist institutions out there. And so that was a message I was just very passionate about, and I wanted to share. I wanted people to know. And I think that when you're putting your faith above all else, and you're putting it, you know, before your political posturing, before your other beliefs or interests, it just impacts the way that you share about those things. And so when I share about feminism, I'm able to do it in a way, I think, or I hope, that really sees the innate goodness of every person, that offers a lot of room for women's individual discernment, which I think is really important, and just helps women understand that, like, Catholic feminists just want their good. Like, we don't want I don't necessarily want every woman to go get a 9-to-5 job. I don't necessarily want every woman to, you know, quit her job and have 10 kids. Like, I want women to have a relationship with the Lord so that they can discern the best path for themselves. And so I think when you come at it from that angle, it helps people see that you really are desiring their good, and it doesn't come off as zealous and attacky, and angry. There's a lot of anger on the internet these days, and it's not always righteous anger. A lot of times it's egotistical anger, and that's something that we try really hard to stay away from. And we also, it's very important to me to keep the Catholic feminist a space that sees the good in all people, including men, and does not, make very blanketed statements about men or, the patriarchy, but really keeps things focused on the goodness of every person, because I think that's what the Lord desires.
So obviously JP2, he's written a lot of stuff that speaks both toward authentic masculinity and authentic femininity. He's probably the most well-known, person writing on just authentic humanity in the most recent 100 years. You also mentioned that some female doctors of the church were people that you were reading. Could you, some names, some books, what were things that you read that had such a great influence on you?
Yeah, Therese of Lisieux, people hear her and they do not think feminist. They think like quiet, cloistered nun who kind of whined a lot. But let me tell you, I read Story of a Soul when I was a missionary at Mizzou, and that book rocked me. It completely changed my faith. It showed me the importance of littleness for everyone, like littleness, whether you're the president of a country or littleness if you're a stay-at-home mom who is just making lemon bars every day. Like, that we all need to have that spiritual littleness, and we all need the Lord. Like that was radical for me, because growing up in that girl power household, I was like, I'm going to lead a movement. Like, I'm going to be protesting in the streets. And like St. Therese taught me the importance of that true humility. And that was really, really good for me. And then I also really love Edith Stein, and I've read some of her writing. And she has a lot of great things to say about gender and what women are really for, what the purpose of women is, how the world needs what women are. And her and JP2, I would say those two in particular formed a lot of the Catholic feminists' thinking. Okay.
On your website, you specifically call out some gruff you have with women's retreats today, and how you can't stand just one more lecture on modesty. How do you contrast that with what we just talked about, JP2 and St. Therese?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because, earlier you asked about Common Core, and I said, I'm always afraid to criticize. And I think in my 4 years, I think I've toned down my criticism of women's retreats, because now that I am involved in a ministry like the Catholic Feminist, I really understand that like the vast majority of people in ministry are really trying their best and are underpaid and overworked. And so if you lead a women's retreat, I really hope that I'm not hurting your feelings. But if I am, sorry. But I have been on, as a missionary, as a faithful Catholic, I've been on women's retreats, women's conferences, all those kinds of things. And what I was seeing was honestly a lot of shallowness. It was a lot of things that seemed to me, it's very interesting that we're giving this such an immense amount of time. It kind of makes me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, how like, you can get all the way up to self-actualization, but at the bottom is like, do you have a roof over your head? And when I'm at these Catholic talks where we're talking about like not stalking boys on Facebook, it's like, okay, also there's like women dying all over the world. Like, why are we not talking about that more? Or like there's, like, what are we wearing? Some of what we're wearing is made by slaves. Are we going to talk about that? Or are we going to talk about whether or not leggings are pants? And it just started to get so frustrating to me that it seemed like women weren't allowed to go deeper. And then I would hear about men's talks from friends, from my husband, and it just always seemed like they were more willing to engage with spiritual warfare and like these tough and intense things that I wanted to talk about too. And I not only wanted to talk about them, but I wanted to talk about them in a feminine way. And by feminine, I don't mean, with sparkly cupcakes in our hand, not that I don't love a good cupcake, but the way that JP2 wrote about like a woman's intuition and a woman's strength, like women are vital to the church and we're vital to those problems. And I wanted to bring women into that. And so that was part of why I started the podcast, honestly, was because I just could not sit through another talk about leggings when it's like, did you know those leggings were made by enslaved people? Like maybe that's what we need to be talking about today instead of, modesty.
Well, gosh, you have some real heavy hitters on your podcast. You had Dr. Monique Rubero, who talked about IVF quite a bit. And the episodes that'll air just prior to this will be my interview with Fiorella Nash, where she went quite in depth with IVF and surrogacy. And I mean, I embarrassingly was just flabbergasted. I was blown away by how like disturbing, distressing, and horrendous IVF and surrogacy can be worldwide. How was your interview with Monique Rubero? What did that expose you to?
Yeah, that is one of my favorite guests. We've actually had her on twice because she was so phenomenal, so intelligent and articulate, and I just could chat with her all day. But when I had her on, I was almost a little fearful because infertility is something really near to my heart. Like I know quite a few women who've struggled with it, and I really, really wanted to be a mother, and I am a mother, and I just couldn't imagine not being able to be a biological mother and what a cross that was. And I wanted to make sure in our conversation that we were acknowledging that not only do so many Catholic women have the cross of infertility, but we are then giving them another cross of like, oh, and you know, this really common procedure that society's all about, we actually don't think that's what's best for you either. And like, that is so difficult. But, you know, as we often say, like, Catholicism is difficult, right? The truth is difficult. And I'm so thankful for people like Dr. Rubero who are able to have those conversations in such a graceful way. And I think what that conversation really opened my eyes to, you know, I already wasn't a big fan of IVF, but the way that she really broke down how IVF goes against what God's design for like making children, and also the bad things that IVF could lead to in our future, like with eugenics and things like that. I mean, I was like you, like I hadn't realized just the depth of how much wrongness IVF could really lead to. Because for me, it was really easy to be like, okay, I kind of get that we're not supposed to have it, but I feel really, really bad for women who are infertile. And like, it just breaks my heart that I'm now telling them they can't do this. But then when I learned more about what IVF is and, you know, its potential for eugenics and things like that, it was like, it's actually the hardest, kindest thing that we can do for our Catholic sisters facing infertility is to be like, I know the world is offering you this option, but it is not for your good. And I love you, and I only want you to have your greatest good. And that's something we run into with the Catholic feminists all the time, because Catholic feminism believes that a lot of things secular feminism thinks are best are actually harmful to women. And it's a lot of saying like, I know what I'm telling you is hard, and I know what I'm telling you isn't what you're hearing from all these other places, but I love you, and I know that you're made in the image of God, and I desire your highest good, and I'm not going to sell you out and give you the easy solution, because you are made for more than that.
Mm-hmm. So going through Mulieris Dignitatem, the dignity of women, and JP2's letter to women in 1995, I mean, he speaks so forcefully, so beautifully about what God's proper plan is for. I think he says, what is it? He instituted marriage as like the proper, not only the proper, the fundamental way that the human species propagates itself. It is like indispensable. That's it. It's an indispensable condition. And it's like, okay, like that's beautiful. That's wonderful to hear. But, you know, not everyone's a Christian. What if, you know, if I'm talking with my Hindu friend, how am I supposed to explain this to them without appealing to the beauty of Christianity? I find secular arguments against the apparent good of IVF, the apparent good of surrogacy, so difficult to say, you know, eloquently, to say convincingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think in general, like, probably because we are Catholics, but like if you take the Lord out of these arguments, it's like, yeah, I mean, if we didn't have the Lord, IVF would make sense. If we didn't have the Lord, abortion would make sense, because who really cares about each individual life, you know? I totally think that's true. It's hard to talk about these issues without being on the same page worldview wise. I think abortion's a little easier. I think I could make a secular abortion argument, but yeah, a secular IVF argument would be hard for me to make, certainly.
Have you ever faced any backlash against your social media platforms?
Oh, every day. An hour
Every
ago.
day. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of DMs on Instagram. I'd say that's the main, like, yeah, people get angry at me all the time. I have like a thick skin by nature, and I'm a writer, so you can't be a writer if you don't have a thick skin. Like, if you cry over criticism, you can't be a writer or a podcaster or a Christian, probably.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I mean, right there though, you've done all your writing and your podcast too. You're doing a lot of work trying to not only portray the gospel, portray God, but also then just like, hey, here's what like authentic femininity looks like out there. And that's why I found it so surprising that just 2 months ago in June, you interviewed Mary Miller and said that you don't feel like you're doing enough.
Marie Miller, the singer? Yeah.
Marie Miller.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I apologize. Yes.
Yeah. I think that we all probably struggle with that. I certainly do some more days than others. I mean, it's hard. Like this morning I was watching a video of a man in Madison, my hometown, who like started a charter school for underprivileged youth. And I'm like, why aren't we starting a charter school? Like, that's so my personality to be like, we need to move to Guatemala tomorrow. When my husband and I got married, he told me that was his number one fear of being married to me. He's like, I'm afraid you're going to wake up one day and be like, the Lord came to me, told me we're moving to Ethiopia. I packed our bags, got on the plane. And I would totally do that. So I think, yeah, I do kind of struggle with just knowing what is enough, and am I making enough of an impact? And, you know, when I read scripture and I read about like Lazarus being stepped over, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, am I stepping over the people standing in the highway median holding signs? And because I live right down the street from Milwaukee, where there's like immense poverty. And so I do struggle with that a lot, but I think that it's kind of all about living in that tension, because I don't think that I'm ever going to get to a point where I'm like, I'm doing enough. And I don't want to not question what I'm doing. I don't want to be so comfortable that I'm never critically evaluating what I'm doing to further the kingdom of God. So I have good days and bad days. On the good days, I'm living in the tension, and I'm like, you know, we're all trying to follow our own calls, and I'm praying, and I'm great. And then I have the bad days where I like look up missions to developing nations, or I'm like, we should sell all our things and start a charter school. Like, I have no educational background. That would be a disaster.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to ask, maybe you've interviewed them, maybe they're long dead, whatever the case, who are some feminists that have had a big influence on you, or someone in a feminist circle that you admire?
Ooh, that's a great question. A few come to mind right away. It's very corny, but I really was influenced by my mom a great deal growing up, because she just completely exemplified to me a person who like lived to serve other people and did it being completely herself. Like, my mom was a public school teacher, and one morning in the dead of winter in Wisconsin, I realized my coat was gone. And I was like, where's my coat? I was probably in like 4th grade. And my mom was like, oh, this girl has been coming to class and she didn't have a coat, so I brought her yours yesterday. And I was like, Mom, like, I'm your child, now I have a coat. And she was like, I'll take you after school to Kohl's, and you're so lucky that you have a mom to just buy you a new coat, and you need to think about. And she really built this foundation for me of thinking outside my own circumstances. And that's a thing that's hard to teach people as adults. So I'm very thankful that I got taught it as a kid. Some other feminists that I really love, a long dead one would be Alice Paul. Alice Paul really broke away from the main suffrage movement and started her own movement, mainly because of racial issues. In the original suffrage movement, there was a lot of racism in the original fight for women to get the right to vote in the United States. Black women weren't allowed at marches or to sign letters, and Alice Paul was not down with that. And so she started a whole new section of suffrages, which is really cool. And she was also very pro-life, which is important to me. And then another one, someone that I have interviewed that I just really, really look up to a lot is Leah Jacobson. She's the founder of the Guiding Star Project, and she's also coming with us on our pilgrimage to France, which I'll talk about later. But she started a holistic women's health center that does all the things that Planned Parenthood thinks that they do and tries to say they do, but don't really do. Guiding Star does mammograms, and they do STD testing, and they help teach young girls about their changing bodies. And it just, to me, is really filling this deep, deep need in a very Catholic way. And so she's very inspiring to me as well. And yeah, I'm just more and more coming to mind. Another long dead one is Sojourner Truth. I really love her. A lot of people know her for her abolitionist work, but she was also very passionate about getting women the right to vote. And she was a speaker who traveled around, and she was also very entrepreneurial and had like a businesswoman's mindset in a really cool way. And then I keep going, but I have to name one more, and that is my girl, Dorothy Day. Everyone who listens to The Catholic Feminist knows I'm a big Dorothy Day fan. And a lot of people today are split on her, and it boggles my mind why. Like, if you are a Catholic who doesn't like Dorothy Day, I'm going to challenge you to read some of her books, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about her and what she thought and what she believed. But she also got jailed for fighting for women to have the right to vote. And she obviously started the Catholic worker houses and was very passionate about having solidarity with the poor, which is something that I constantly need a reminder of. And she loved the Lord. And this, she really started out so far from him. She got an abortion, and she was involved with the socialists, and she started out not on the path to the Lord at all. And then she had a major conversion. And by the time she died, she got a lot of criticism within the Catholic worker movement for being too Catholic, for being too orthodox. And sometimes I want to go up to the rad trads who don't like her and shake them and be like, she got hated on just like you do for being too Catholic. So she's a big one to me as well.
Those were all fantastic examples, and I love that you started with your mom. That was true. Like, such a great example of charity and love for your neighbor. That was great. Thank you. So the split in feminism. There's different waves of feminism, and depending on who you ask and who that person, what that person's leanings may be, someone might say that, somewhere between the second, third, or fourth wave, feminism has really lost its way. Specifically, I'm thinking about, could you comment on the Women's March today? How pro-life feminists were kicked out of the March on DC, the March on Washington Women's March.
I'd love to. I think what you said is very important about how a lot of it is depending on who you ask, because similar to the civil rights movement, it's really hard to give specific years, specific leaders. There's always, anyone can name Martin Luther King the same way anyone can name Susan B. Anthony, but there's a lot more to these movements than those specific people. And depending on who you ask, you can get a really different story of feminism. So I tend to be in the camp that says first wave feminism of getting women the right to own property, the right to vote. I think we're pretty much all on board with that. Do I meet a crazy person now and then who says women shouldn't vote? Yes, I do. But that is not the majority by any means. But the second wave feminism, to me, is really where feminism started to veer away from the gospel and towards our purpose in life. And the Women's March today, a lot of people say that today we're kind of in a fourth wave feminism, which is probably something I'd agree with. It really does not break down to being anything good for women. And the Women's March is so interesting, because when the Women's March was first created, way back in a Facebook group, it was supposed to be this march that was just for all women to say, we're here, we support each other, we take up space, we have dignity. Obviously, all great things. Again, 90% of people would agree with what I just said. But like so many massive movements, once you appoint leaders and once you formalize it, you can either go, this way or that way. And they went that way. And what that way meant was that they had a very specific agenda. It was not just women have dignity, let's support one another. It was very particular. It was saying, we support unlimited access to abortion. It was saying we support surgery for transgender people. It was saying we do not support the right of churches to hire who they want. And so when you have that very specific agenda, obviously groups are going to get excluded. And sadly, that's exactly what we saw happen. And I think that is tragic, because when I go to like a pro-life event, if Planned Parenthood wants to come on in. I want you there. I want you listening to the pro-life speakers. I want you seeing that we have so much in common. Like, me and someone who works at Planned Parenthood actually probably have a ton in common. We both care about women. We both don't want women to be harassed. We both want women to be healthy. Like, we have a huge foundation that we could stand on together. And like, I'm willing to stand there and they're not. And that's something that I see really us going towards that trend in culture in general, which is like, can we talk about what we agree on? Can we stand on a platform together and say like, look, we have differences that are really big, that really matter. And I'm not trying to make those small, but we do also have so much that we could fight together for. And I think the Women's March just completely missed that mark. And so I'm not here for the Women's March, to be frank. I'm not about its leadership. I'm not about the groups that attend. I'm not about the hats that look like genitalia. I find those extremely strange. That's my feelings on that.
So then to go in the opposite direction, you mentioned the rad trads. I attend the Novus Ordo, whatever. What are your thoughts about veiling, wearing a veil at Mass?
Yeah, I'm married to a rad trad. I should be frank there. Well, that's a lie. He's an extremely holy, good person. He's not like a trolley rad trad, but he loves him a good Latin Mass. He's very Orthodox. He doesn't want a guitar at his Mass, if you know what I'm saying. I can get down with a guitar. Veiling is, to me, I honestly don't think about veiling a lot, to be honest. I think if you want to veil and that's your way that you express your love for the Lord and you think that that's the biblical thing to do, I'm certainly not going to like rip anyone's veil off their head. I don't think anyone should be required to wear a veil either, though. I think that we seem to pay a lot of attention to what people are wearing at Mass in a way that is very odd to me, kind of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs situation. I'm like, I'm glad you're at church and I want you to wear what you think helps you honor God the most. And maybe we have differences in that, and I'm just probably really not going to notice what anyone is wearing. Yeah, I just don't think about veils a lot, to be honest.
So there's veils and like the impression of modesty, also going back to our talk earlier about like modest is hottest and all that stuff. And then there's also this other side from maybe let's call them frontline feminists who say like, you know what, it's my body and I love the way I look, so forget modesty. If I'm naked or if I'm topless or whatever, like who cares? That's great. Could you talk about where should we try to fall in this spectrum of I guess
clothing,
women's exposure?
Yeah. I think when you say something like, I love my body, I want to go topless, like, okay, in the Garden of Eden you probably could have done that and it could have been beautiful and amazing because there was no sin. And often we want to live in the world as if there's no sin. And unfortunately, there is sin, and it is everywhere, and it is pervasive. So women's bodies are beautiful. I mean, look at the art that has been dedicated to the beauty of a woman's form. And I mean, not to get all Christopher West on you, but once you learn theology of the body and the things that a woman's body can do, it's just phenomenal. So I want to start there. But at the same time, we do live in this world where sin exists. And if we didn't, we could wear whatever we wanted. We could say whatever we wanted. We could do whatever we wanted, but we can't. And I think it's the same way that, like, if something is valuable to you in your house, like, you really shouldn't have to lock your house. Like you should trust the other humans in the world to not come in and steal what is in your house. But sin is in the world and people might do that. And so in some ways we have to do like a metaphorical locking of literally wearing a shirt. But then I just think sometimes it goes so far into like how much time are we giving the conversation of what women are wearing? Because it seems to me like we're giving it a lot. And I just don't think about it that much. I think that women need to wear what makes them feel beautiful and what makes them glorify the Lord while having an awareness, certainly, that sin exists. And I know some feminists don't like to hear that. And I don't like to say it. I don't like that sin exists. I wish that I didn't ever have to worry about anyone looking at me. But you do. And I think that that's part of being a neighbor. And this is from someone who's, wearing a tank top right now. I'm not saying that we have to wear long sleeves and long pants all the time. I also think that modesty is a mindset. And you can be modest in a tank top and you can be immodest in a sweater. The attitude that you have when you're putting your clothes on. Like, are you getting dressed to attract sexual attention? Or are you getting dressed because you need to put clothes on? I mean, I'm not a very fashionable person. So honestly, in the morning, I'm not like, what helps me glorify the Lord? I'm like, what's clean that like my kids aren't gonna rip and ruin. And I think it's about having a mindset of care for your neighbor and having no shame about your body and what it was made for. Because the other thing is that I have to mention, women often get shamed based on their body types in a way that I find extremely unfair. Like if women are, have larger endowment on top, like they're the ones who are going to get called out for being immodest. Like small, skinny women without any curves aren't usually called out for that. And that just seems very unjust to me and something that we need to be aware of as well.
To build off that, so my wife is pregnant, just finishing up her second. Yeah, thank you. She's at the end of her second trimester, and like the pressure she has, like, oh, well, you just look chubby right now. I don't know how many times in a week she'll look at me and say, like, do these make me look fat? Does this shirt, is it hugging does the belly look like I'm pregnant, or does it look like I'm just chubby? And it's like, who cares? Like, you're pregnant. Come on, who cares?
Yes.
Stop.
Society cares though. Like that's the problem, is that like people do care and draw so much attention to women's shapes in a way that I just do not see them doing with men. But I completely agree. I'm like, girlfriend, your body is growing a human being. Cut the thing some slack. Like it's doing some good work.
And then even just to also keep going off what you were saying, I originally had this down as a counterpoint, but I took a trip to Brazil when I was in college. I remember going around the beach and seeing all these little boys running around they wear something that's a little bigger than a Speedo. That's just normal. Okay. So, okay, fine, whatever. And then I realized, like, wait, these are little boys and girls. That's a girl. And I turned to my host brother and I was like, hey man, how come all these little girls are running around topless? And he's like, what do you mean? Like, they're like 5 years old. They're the same as the boys. Basically what he said was they'll start wearing, women's swimsuits with a top, like when they start developing. And it's like, okay, well then they need that. In the meantime, come on, that kid's 4 years old and, like making a sandcastle. Who cares? So
and that's a good point. Like modesty is cultural. I mean, my sister spends a lot of time in Belize, and it's like the opposite of what you were saying. Like they're extremely covered, even though it's like 1,000,000 degrees there. Like every time she goes, she's like, I'm gonna die of heat, because she has to wear things that go beneath her knees, and she has to have her arms covered her elbows. Like they're just in the area that she goes to. I'm not sure about the entire country, but in the area she goes to, it's extremely modest. And this would be like straight scandal for them. So like it is also very cultural. It's a good point.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to move. We've been talking about feminism and sort of appearance and maybe a little bit of politics. I'd like to move into feminism and employment. So obviously you've got a podcast, you're an author, you were also doing focus ministries and all this stuff. So season 2 of Generation Vatican II, we're going through John Paul II's letter to women, published in 1995, which draws heavily from his earlier work, Mulieris Dignitatem, The Dignity of Women. sidebar. Have you heard any like Christian circles espousing this idea that, you know what, the woman shouldn't be working. The woman should be like, it is her proper place according to the ordering that God gave us, that she should be a homemaker. Have you encountered any of that?
Once a week. Yes.
Really?
Yeah,
Please.
often.
What's your experience?
I, again, with the DMs, and I get a lot of weird emails too. And then also I'm on Twitter. I feel like every time I say I'm on Twitter, I follow it up with like, Twitter's killing our souls and we all need to get off, yet I'm still on there. So riddle me that. But I hear about it a lot, just about, like we shouldn't be encouraging women to work. And people will send me, there's a couple of big studies that say like the importance of a child's development for the first 3 years. To have the mom home is really good for that child, which I'm not disagreeing with. And people just saying that, the family is under attack, and part of the way that the devil's attacking it is that he's taking the woman out and making her work, and all kinds of things that are silly in 2020, mm-hmm. if you want my honest opinion.
Mm-hmm. So if you've encountered that specifically, like, how do you handle this idea, this critique of the proper ordering of the family?
The proper ordering of the family, to me, is what helps the family get to heaven and what helps the family thrive. And that is going to look different for each family. And part of me says, I cannot believe I'm still saying this 4 years later, but I want to make space for people who grew up thinking very differently, or who want to have heterodox thinking. Like, I understand, but when you look at a family, they are made up of different people who are given different gifts. And there are women who thrive staying at home with their children, who that is their God-given call. And they are the moms who are helping the working moms do their thing. I mean, if there weren't women who were working at home who could babysit my children every now and then and volunteer in their classrooms and all that good things, I couldn't do what I do. We're an ecosystem. We help each other thrive and grow. And, bringing up that study, for instance, that I mentioned that said that it's very beneficial for children to have the mom home the first 3 years. Okay, I buy that. It's also beneficial for the children to only eat organic food. Well, that doesn't help everyone in the family thrive, because I don't have time to cook you 3 organic meals a day. And I need to thrive too. And you need to thrive, right? It's a balancing act. It's saying what's the best for the family as a unit. What's best for this person that hurts these other people is then not necessarily good for the family. The same way that, if a woman had a certain number of kids and was very involved in their life, maybe a couple of them have special needs, I don't know, and she, wants to go be a job that is from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., maybe that's not the best thing for her family. And then maybe the most feminist thing for her to do is to say, what is my womanhood for? It is for helping other people get to heaven, and I have to say no to that opportunity. It's all about an individual's circumstances and the makeup of an individual family. And I don't like any broad things like a woman's place. I mean, women are just so different, and women have so many gifts to offer. I mean, I could go on my soapbox here, but Edith Stein talking about, any profession that's done by a man can be done by a woman. That's an important thing to remember, because there really are a lot of people who still are in that mindset. My sister-in-law, my husband's sister, is single. She's not attached at all. And she was doing interviews for medical residency. She's a surgery resident right now. And she had so many people saying to her things like, well, how are you going to take care of your kids? Like, in an interview, like asking her how she's going to make this work. And she's like, A, I don't have children. So I'm not even dating anyone. So it's just a very odd thing for you to be asking me. And B, like, I don't know, maybe I'll marry a husband who's going to be a stay-at-home dad, and that's the best way we all thrive. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, in my humble opinion.
Okay, so full disclosure, we agree on this. I just did, 3.5 hours worth of episodes, content, arguing exactly that. So to prevent this from being like just us stovepiping our conversation,
high-fiving each other.
Yeah. So one thing you said, Edith Stein, any job done by a man can be done by a woman. Okay, so there are these 2 documents that are cited. They're like the bedrock of this proper ordering of the family. Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, Pope Pius XI, Casti Connubii. And in those, that you will encounter phrases, something to the effect of like, men and women should be employed when necessary, in a way that like fulfills their dignity as a man and a woman. And it's very much like there is, each sex has their own gifts, and they should focus on that, as opposed to like trying to branch over and say like, well, I'm good at this, so I'll do what a woman can, and well, I'm good at that, so I'll do what a man can. It seems very against this idea that any job done by a man can be done by a woman. Anything you can do, I can do better.
I'd have to see like the specific phrasing. I've kind of seen those documents but haven't sat and read them in like explicit detail. I think that when you look at, like something that has been said in the past is the idea that women are put in this place to serve, right? I mean, and JP2 writes about that. And I think a lot of popes have talked about that a woman's place is to serve, the household. But I think that that's where we start to pigeonhole women into saying, what does service look like? What does a woman's role look like? Okay, you could say like, well, a woman's role is providing food for the family. Okay, does that necessarily mean like cooking it? Maybe not. Maybe it means like making the money to buy it. And I think it's about expanding that idea of what is service, and not at all in a way that looks down on service or looks down on femininity. I love to cook. I cook all the time. I bake all our bread. I mean, I have a lot of stereotypically feminine traits about me. But to just pigeonhole the idea of a woman's role and service in that very like 1950s housewife vision, I think is just short-sighted. I mean, I do believe that kids benefit a lot from spending a lot of time with their parents, but I also think that in some ways, I know this is a hot button word right now that I don't love to use a ton, but it's also kind of a privileged conversation. Like when we say if necessary, it is necessary. For a lot of people, it is necessary that both parents go work and then somehow have enough money to pay for the childcare that they're then going to need. I think that we have to look at modern times and again, go back to that thriving. Like, how can we help these families thrive? And I think most popes throughout history have wanted the thriving of the family. And if they said things that I would disagree with, not from the chair of St. Peter, obviously, but if they just written things that I disagree with, I mean, I'm allowed to do that as well and still be a Catholic. And I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt that it also has to do with the timing in which a lot of things are written. If you go back to the 50s and 60s and you look at, sure, in the U.S., we had the sexual revolution, but that was also really a global movement in a lot of ways. And I think that a lot of the church was rightly afraid of the family no longer being that cornerstone of society and really wanting to emphasize an importance on the family, which I think is very good. So I think that, without having like a specific phrase that I can agree or disagree with, I would just say that women are, designed to serve, and that's an honor. And you can do that as the president of a country. You should be doing that as a president of the country. Do presidents always do that? I'll let you decide that. But it's important, I think, to not pigeonhole, I guess, is what I would say.
Okay, so full disclosure, we did not talk beforehand, so this isn't like I told you what I was going to say and you're just agreeing with me. So I'm glad you said what you said, because that's effectively what I argue too, that, in my investigation of, Rerum Novarum, Casti Connubii, Mulieris Dignitatem, or even like official magisterial teachings that bear the weight of sacred tradition, they all seem to reference service of women or the gifts of women in a much more esoteric manner. That's just like, here are some loose adjectives, do with it what you want. And then from that, people are misinterpreting it and saying, well, that means this, which means that, which means that, which means that. And then 10 steps later, they're saying, and that's why it's a mortal sin for a woman to work outside the home. And it's like, dude.
I don't know why people want to take away the gift that the church has given us of discernment. Like, we are not Scientologists. The Catholic Church gives us so much room to make our own decisions. It's so beautiful and like honoring of each of us made in the image of God that the church sets forth, proper boundaries and rules. And then within those boundaries, you have so much freedom to live out your own unique gifts and your own unique personality. And I just do not understand why we have lost the ability to say, this is what's good for my family. That's what's good for your family. If neither of them are against church teaching, live and let live a little bit. And I get that, we really want to avoid relativism in 2020. I certainly do too. But I'm saying like within the boundaries of that proper church teaching, there's a lot of room.
Okay, so let's wrap this up with a nice bow. Can you talk to us about the feminine genius? How do you express your feminine genius?
Yes, I love the feminine genius. I love John Paul II's writings on it. And something that the feminine genius always makes me think of is just the idea of strength and how strong women are. And like biologically on a whole, maybe our biceps aren't quite as big, but when you think of, the Lord on the cross, you think of the women who were sitting at the feet of that cross and just the strength that took and the strength of Mary's yes. And that idea of strength has been really important to me, in particular these last few years with the podcast, on a practical level of, I've had no childcare since March, so I'm working 40 hours and taking care of 2 kids all the time. I have a great husband, I should say that. But I think that immense strength I've had to really pull from. But then I also think on a deep spiritual level, when you look around at 2020, it is very easy to feel despair in all directions. Like to just feel like the church is under attack, like humanity is under attack, people are terrible, there's death everywhere. I think it'd be really quick to go there. And then I think of the women standing at the feet of the cross. They probably felt that 10,000 times more than I do in my comfy suburban home, knowing that the Lord has risen. That strength is really where I can pull from to live out all of the gifts that being a woman has given me. And that's a unique, emotional, empathetic strength that I think women in particular have been gifted with. And that hopeful strength is what I've seen a lot of. And so that's kind of how I'm living it out right now. Just trying to stay hopeful in the Lord.
Hopeful strength. That is a terrific, I think that I might have to make that the title of this. I don't know how I'm going to do that.
I'm a writer.
Okay. 2 last questions. What can women do to better be their authentic self?
Pray. That is not a cop-out. People frequently tell me that is a cop-out, but it's not. If we all prayed 15 minutes a day, the world would change. Every single person needs to find time to pray every day. You can do it. If you're listening to this podcast, you can do it. You got time to sit and find time to pray, because we talk a lot about women finding their unique role, their unique journey, and you are not going to find that if you're not praying. So prayer is definitely what I think women need to do.
And that it's easy to say that and sound like overly pious, again, like we were talking earlier, but like, gosh, in the past 3 years, my wife and I have really tried to like make a concerted effort in improving our prayer life. And it's been fantastic. Like improvements in our daily lives, in our marriage. Oh gosh. Mm-hmm. So yes, that's not just some cop-out answer.
No.
Second question, what can women do to help other women?
I think listening to each other's stories more often is really important. Like before you go in guns blazing of like, here's how I'm going to solve whatever crisis of the moment you want to solve, of which there are many you can choose from at this point in time. I think listening to each other without an agenda is something so important. And I think we're losing that. That's what scares me, is I am seeing a lost ability to be able to converse with one another and just hear each other's stories and hear what the other person needs. Just to talk to women, if you're really passionate about being pro-life, but you've never talked to a woman who's faced an unknown pregnancy, like how can you get connected with one? Because you are not going to be able to understand that issue without really hearing the stories of the women who have lived through it. Or if you're really passionate about race issues and racial justice, like look around at who you're learning from. And I'm not saying like one specific policy or anything like that. Diversify your listening experience, absolutely. But make sure that you're taking the time to do that listening and research before you put anything into like a firm action.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. I think that about wraps it up for us today. Claire Swinarski, what's your website?
TheCatholicFeministPodcast.com. Everything's on there.
Great. And where can we find you on social media?
You can find me at The Catholic Feminist, and that's also where you can learn a lot more about our pilgrimage to France. If you like hearing about these kind of topics, if you want to talk about faith and feminism with a bunch of amazing Catholics, you should come with us to France in October 2021. We're going to go to Lisieux, we're going to go to Paris, and it's just going to be the trip of a lifetime. So you can learn all about that at thecatholicfeministpodcast.com, or my socials are The Catholic Feminist.
Great, thank you. Podcast, obviously, you just gave us the name there. And what are the names of your books, and where can people get them?
Oh gosh, so I have 2 books with Ave Maria, Girl Arise, and In Full Bloom, and then I have 2 fiction books, What Happens Next, and then my next one coming out next year is called The Kate in Between. And so you can get all info on those actually at my personal website, which is claireswinarski.com.
Great, thank you so much. Claire,
Thank
thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having
Bye.
me.